Thank you for joining us this morning. We are recording this webinar. It will be placed on our YouTube webpage, SBSS YouTube page for future reference. This morning's webinar is about subcontractor participation in the progressive design build process. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
Raphael?
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. All right. So I'm Harry Overstreet II. I am the post-award project administrator for our Small Business Support Services program. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We just ask that you mute yourself. That'll take care of all the background noises. We do have a chat function. Feel free to place any questions in the chat and we will try and get to those questions, or you're also welcome to raise your hand and we will try and address questions. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit of an overview about our program as a whole, we have some excellent pre-award services which are designed to help you pursue and secure BART works. And a specialist from our pre-award team, he's also on our post-award team, but that's with us is Michael Reyes. And we have a lot of, like I said, a lot of great pre-award services from marketing materials, help with navigating the procurement portal, all sorts of things. Of course, I am on the primarily on the post-award side, where we have covered practically all of the procedures and processes required to help you successfully complete a BART project. So if you have any issues, any questions about your project, please feel free to reach out to me. If it's not something that we can address directly with our technical specialists, we are able to refer those over to the Office of Civil Rights if it's a prompt payment issue or something that's out of our scope, or for any other materials. But we have a lot of great material, and BART knows that that it can be difficult. So that's why we're here to help you. Next slide, please. And with that, I will introduce turn this over to Raphael Boland, who is a current BART RE and a technical specialist on the program, and is able to help with a variety of things. And with that, I will turn it over to Raphael.
Great. Thank you. So thanks, everybody. I am going to talk to us about progressive design build. I'm going to very briefly touch on one of the differentiators at the high level between design build and design bid build. But then for the bulk of the presentation, I'm really going to focus on the practical differences as a BART consultant working on a design build, progressive design build versus design bid build. So that will be the bulk of the presentation. So just to start with some definitions, design build is a delivery method that combines design and construction services into a single contract. And the design builder or the contractor, I'll use those terms interchangeably, is responsible for doing both elements of the scope. In general, in this presentation, I'm going to contrast design build with design bid build, which has historically been the default, at least in California, delivery method for owners and in particular for BART. And then we're going to talk about progressive design build, which is a subset within the world of DB, where the design builder and the owner have a special relationship that predates the actual award. And I'll walk through that in a second. So at a high level, the biggest difference between design build and design bid build is the scope that goes out to be performed by the contractor or design builder. So at the top, you have a design bid build, a conventional timeline where design is performed usually with a separate consultant, starting typically around 15% all the way through issue for bid. That support might extend further through bid and award and even into design services during construction, but there's a break when it goes into bid and award. For design bid build, these are typically hard bids, sealed envelope type bids, where it goes to the lowest responsible bidder. And then you have the construction phase. So this is the model that we're all used to. Below is the design build model where design may only progress to no more than 35%. Now, that could vary depending on the subtype. For instance, at BART, there are certain elements, particularly in communication and train control, things like that nature, where the interfaces are specialized and therefore the design might extend up to, say, 65%, but much further than that, and you lose the benefit of a design bid and it just becomes a design build and it just becomes a design bid. So somewhere around 15 to 35 design, a longer bid and award. If you look at the orange bar below, it's actually longer in the second one. And that's on purpose because in this model, you typically have a two-stage. You'll have a best value or a pre-qualification phase, and then you have a BAFO, a best and final offer phase, where the owner negotiates on price. And then, of course, the green bar is longer because it includes both the finalization of the design and the construction. And those are not start-stop, and we'll go through that, but there's some overlap that is implicit in this design method. The punchline, though, is that if you look at the bottom, it ends sooner. That's really the main driver for why owners do it. It's a schedule-driven advantage. So let's talk about specifically progressive design build. How does that differ? So in progressive design build, the owner will bring the firm in, whoever the DB firm in early to assist with the design. Right. So in the one on the right here, the conventional design build, the owner hires an outside consultant to take the design through the 35% phase, let's say 35, and then hands it off to a design builder. In progressive design build, the DB is involved earlier, and it's an iterative process with the owner to actually develop the scope and also typically the budget for those packages. So the added advantage is that you get input as to where those risk areas are, not just from the owner's perspective, but also from the constructor's perspective, right? So ideally you get better alignment between the price of these packages and the what, but also it allows more flexibility to the owner to, if they're not actually sure what the design is going to look like, this model gives them that advantage. So then you have two packages. You have a pre-construction, which is essentially um, the owner hiring the DB firm to finalize or to take it to some point, I should say. And then you have a final series of packages, which would be the actual construction. Whereas in the conventional model, it's one contract that would span both design and build, as we showed before. So why would owners do it? The main one is we talked about is schedule, right? If you look at the total life cycle, design build can be or is intended to be quicker than design bid build. You have to look at the whole life cycle. If you just look at the design build contract itself, by definition, it's not quicker because it includes design elements. But if you look at the life cycle, that's the main advantage. Cost, sometimes, and we'll talk a little bit about why sometimes, but in general, contractors typically have better, faster, smarter ways to do things. And so their means and methods can be incorporated into the design in a way that they can't on a hard bid. But the reverse can also be true. We talked about flexibility. In particular, in progressive design, it allows a lot more flexibility in the design, right? The owner doesn't need to know on day one what they want. They just need to know what they want to achieve. And then they'll work with the design builder and the consultants to try to develop that. And then we talked about risk identification. So again, this is a progressive design build specialty, but by identifying those earlier, you can work with the funding to sort of develop separate packages of risk, or even tie your risk register to your budget better than you do in design bid build. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm really just going to focus on the so what. Like, how does this make my life different as a aspiring BART consultant? So I'm going to focus on the processes that we do here at BART, on the CM, DSDC, design, etc. And I'm going to say what is different about working in a design build environment versus a design bid build. So remember that, again, the contrast is always back to the conventional. And I'm just going to go through these, and we're going to cite some examples and go through those, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So the first and most obvious one we've chatted about, but just to say it because it's there. Obviously, the overall scope for the consultant is different, right? So there's still a design element, a pure design element, where the owner may require an outside designer, and that could be, but remember, that's only typically 15 to 35, sometimes as much as 65% for specialized scope. There's still a need for CM, for construction management, and this would be through the life cycle of design and build. So a little bit different than where it's bifurcated. And likewise with DSDC or design services during construction. So the owner still has need for a representative to respond to submittals and RFIs, et cetera. And then BART is moving more towards this model where they have a third consultant come in to do review. And that really could be any version of the above, right? It could span just the beginning portion. It could span the whole phase. It could go through the bid and award phase. There's different ways that could happen, but that's a new thing that BART is really pushing. So be aware of that as well. So let's start with the pay process. So um, overall, the pay process on DB is the same, right? You have monthly invoices that come in from the contractor. You have to look at what did they do that month, and you have to make sure that it's in a correct format for BART payment and get it through the system. So what's different about it is because the scope wouldn't necessarily be known at award, you tend to see more lump sum values than you do in design bid build. So it's incumbent on us to look at breaking those down into smaller chunks, and we'll talk about that in a second. Um, there's also going to be payment for design type items, right? And so most of the time we're pretty good at doing estimates for things like concrete and rebar and things like that. It's a little trickier when you get into design items, right? Because now you're talking level of effort type stuff where a lot of the work may have happened before you actually see a deliverable. So that's something that's different. And then even more so, items like project management or mobilization really are level of effort type stuff, right? They're more time based than they are thing based. So some of the items in design build might be unit prices. It's not uncommon that an owner will put out an estimated quantity. For instance, on my contract, we have estimates of conduit. So those are just plug numbers where you say, assume 5,000 feet of this type of conduit. And then that's relatively easy to track because it's on a linear foot basis. But most of them will be lump sum, as we've talked about. And then they may also include items such as quality or PM or what have you that will have to be worked out, whether it's time phased or thing phased. So example, so I mentioned how these are typically lump sum. Here's an example from a project I'm working on here at BART right now, where we have a single line item, which is really just installation of equipment in a train control house. Just one number would be associated with that. But in reality, this is going to get broken down into subsets, right? The location of the house, the type of the work being performed, the phase on the project. The order of those three above could vary, right? Sometimes maybe the phase goes first, but in general, that's really what it is, right? Where it is, what it is, when it is are kind of the three things that you'd use to break it down. And here's an example down here where we broke it down based on locations. And then inside this, there'll be another level even below that where we'll start getting into the type of equipment. So you get the idea that it starts out at a relatively high level, but very quickly becomes much more granular. So another big differentiator is quality. So in design build, um, typically the design builder is both the quality control and the quality assurance. So this is a marked difference from the way BART runs design bid build, right? Where we, the CM, would be the quality assurance, and the actual contractor would be the quality control, right? So um, there's still a role for consultants in this situation because someone has to oversee that and ensure that it's being done and done right. There's also typically audits that are performed, and sometimes those audits even extend to the BART team, right? So we might do self audits, as we call it, and make sure we're doing things right. So there's still a role for the CM to monitor and provide oversight. So example, and I just listed the takeaways on the right in terms of type of work that would exist in the quality sphere given that breakdown. So even though the DB produces the overall QC/QA plan, someone's got to look at it, make sure it's good, because that's the thing that we're gonna build off of. So there's a design review. Stuff in the field, right? I'm going to use the example of concrete where there's a QC role, but there's also typically a QA role in terms of casting cylinders. Someone's got to ensure that that happens and make sure that that's done correctly, up to and including maybe some field verification. So there's some opening for field review as well. We may do oversight to confirm that QC and QA are doing what they're doing. Um, Both the consultants or BART and the DB can issue NCRs. So those processes exist and require consultant support. And then, as I mentioned, there's audits, right? Self audits and external audits, just to ensure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. So let's talk about the change process. So that's another really big differentiator. So because the scope, well, two big differentiators. One is because now you have both construction and design work. There's really two sets of BART provisions for changing the contract. There's the one most of us are probably familiar with, what some people call force account, or time and material is another way people refer to it, and that's a very prescriptive set of specs that's in the GCs that tell you what prevailing wage is, what the prescribed fringes are, what the allowable markups are. These are all very standard things. When it comes to design work, it's more complicated. Not the least of which is because we're typically not in a designer's office with a stopwatch counting them as we would be out in the field. And so that's just a differentiator. Um, so the other thing is, we talked about, remember how a lot of these items are not going to have specific quantities at bid day, right? You're not going to have a set of plans day one that tell you you have to pour 5,200 yards of concrete. You're going to have a performance-based requirement that there be a footing sufficient to hold this equipment. Only later will you know that it's 5,200 yards of concrete. And so changes are trickier, right? If you add something, you're not going to be able to just do a takeoff and see what that add is. So changes in quantities are less common, and changes are a little harder to quantify than they are in design bid build. That extends to the very definition of a change. Okay, so um, in general, design build specifications, when properly created, are performance based. So essentially, BART is saying what they want, not how to do it. And that's on purpose, because that's what they're paying for. They're paying for the expertise to translate that into action. So, but they have to be very careful, because if I, as an owner, say that I want a four-wheeled vehicle, I may be thinking of a Chevrolet, but I might get a skateboard, which is also a four-wheeled vehicle, right? And so changes are trickier, because you have to be able to, um, first of all, really understand what the contract required, not just what you wanted, and then see if this is a change or not a change to the contract. Um, so um, a big part of that is what I call nice to haves. Okay, and this is always a slippery slope, because into the ownership of the scope of the contract, right? Is because the contract in this condition just said four-wheeled vehicle, but Bart secretly wanted a Chevrolet. Um, you're looking at a change order. But maybe Bart also wants a Lamborghini and not a Chevrolet. And so then it's incumbent on us to understand, really, is a Lamborghini required, or is a Lamborghini just a nice to have, because there's a significant price difference. So part of what we're here to do is to inform and let BART make the decision, obviously, but let them know that Lamborghinis cost a lot more, and that Chevrolets functionally do the same thing, right? They both, act as cars, and they generally get you where you need to go. Um, so um, the other part, and we touched about it a little bit, is, of course, because it's more design based, you get more design type changes, and those are generally trickier to price and set aside than thing based stuff, right? As I said, like, if you had a 5,200 yard concrete pour and it went to 5,500 yards, I think we could all figure out how to price that. When you get to um, you know design of an HVAC system, we're not all HVAC designers, right? So it's a little trickier to sometimes how to price that change. I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but this is one of the big differentiators between this type of bidding. So here's an example, right? And this is on a systems-based contract, which makes it even trickier, because in systems-based contracts, a lot of the upfront work is behind a curtain, right? So again, much closer to the designer behind a computer screen than the pouring concrete model. Um, so in this model, it's often useful to break those change orders into two. This is something I've used successfully at BART, which is you do a notice to not to exceed, notice to proceed change for essentially advancing the design to a certain point. And then you can do a lump sum CO for the agreed scope once you have it, right? So this works when you know there's a problem, but you don't really know what the solution is. Um, And then this is another one that I've used. This wasn't at BART; it was at another railroad, but similar idea is we had a design build where we had, in this case, thousands of foundations for an overhead catenary system. We were switching from a diesel to an electrified system, and as you can imagine, you get all kinds of issues with the footing, where the soil is soft, soil is too hard, what have you. So we came up with predefined or grouped solutions, right? So in the case of footings, you could say, here's a pre-approved solution with a casing. Here's a pre-approved for tight access, where you have a different type of footing. And so it won't catch everything, but in many cases, if you agree up front, the time is generally more expensive than the cost of a little bit of extra concrete, right? And that's another central element of design build, because the design builder is footing the bill both ways. You always have to weigh the design cost versus the material cost. And then we talked about the nice to haves. We'll get into that a little bit more. One way to work around nice to haves at BART is to sometimes come up with a really good order of magnitude, and that can even involve talking to your design builder. And that's because sometimes, people, back to the Lamborghini motto, like, I like Lamborghinis, but do I like them at $350,000? Not really. All of a sudden, Chevrolet looks like a really nice car. And then the big part there with BART in particular is really, really important that you get your concurrences first, right? So we can advise, we can provide our advice, but at the end of the day, it's a BART call, so we need to get their concurrence. If we're going to move forward with a Chevrolet, make sure that that's something that the various stakeholders can live with, right? If you have RSNS telling you that they need a Toyota, better to know that before you issue the change order. Submittals. Um, the big difference there is that submittals are, they're not going to all be listed. They're not going to be all called out. You probably don't even know where all the submittals are. Secondly, the submittals will have different levels of completion. So in a design bid build, you typically see the submittal once, maybe make comments, then you see it again and you approve it and you move on. In design builds, you're going to see it at various levels. It could be 35, it could be 65. Um, and that's a big differentiator, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we go through document control. It's an important part of making sure your documents are in order. One thing to note is that depending on the model of who the design builder is, sometimes they have their own designer. Sometimes they'll have the equivalent of a GC, an AECOM, an HNTB, or somebody like that. In which case, they may there may be a lot more design changes than we're typically used to, right? So if the design builder controls access to the designer and not BART, then very often you'll see a lot of design changes trying to save cost, right? When it's their money, design builders are very aggressive with saying, well, shoot, if we can get by with 3 nails, why would we put 4 nails in, right? Because they're not necessarily bearing the construction cost. So something to think about. Um, and then a big thing that I mentioned before, but sorry, is that the advantage of design build is that you're advancing these at different levels, right? So you could be at a 15% on your landscaping and an 85% on your design, and actually be building some of the physical elements, and that's okay. So you just need to be able to track the various levels. And they may be proceeding with that. So you just have to always be cognizant that it's not a finish 100% design and then start construction. So some examples, one would be fiber optic, because many times the fiber optic backbone could be known, but the actual things you're plugging into could still be worked on. And quite frankly, it doesn't matter, right? So it's quite possible that you could be installing miles of fiber without knowing exactly what's going to travel through that fiber, and that's okay. So you can order material before the design is complete, as long as the design builder is confident that the design is not going to change that. One example would be, for instance, on train control houses, right? You may have 9, 10, 27 different things that are all, required, and you could be ordering most, but not all of those, and wait on, what we call in scheduling a finish to finish versus a finish to start type of situation to keep that schedule, um, just to keep it going. Um, so let's talk about RFIs. So that really gets into the scope question again that I think came up before. And I see some questions in the chat about that as well. Um, it's trickier because the scope isn't as easily defined, right? Normally, one of the big purposes of an RFI is to clarify the scope, right? So, sheet C103 detail 2 shows a dimension of 12 feet. However, on detail sheet, blah, 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 it shows 11 and a half feet. Please clarify. You're not going to get those kinds because that level of detail doesn't exist. So the RFIs on Design Builder are more about what you can do versus clarifications of design, right? They have an intent and they're trying to match what the owner's asking for, and they're just trying to align that. There's also this thing called a gap process, which this is especially true on system type projects where the design builder is essentially providing a system, and the system mostly but not completely aligns with what the owner needs, then you're going to end up with these gaps, and you have to resolve what you do with those. Can you accept certain gaps? Can you change order certain gaps, or do you have to change your base product to make that happen? So those are another big source of RFI. But the sort of warning I would give everyone here is that the line between RFIs and changes can be harder to ascertain, right? Because you're not simply asking for clarification. You may really be asking for a change order and just not calling it that. So I'll give you an example. Typically, those RFIs will take the form of confirm that it shall be acceptable to use X in lieu of Y, right? So an example would be, um, back to the car. Let's say the contract was very prescriptive and it did say a Chevrolet, and it provided specifications on that. I could come back and say, please confirm this will be acceptable to use one of those rental scooters in lieu of a Chevrolet. They both have four wheels. They're both basically the same thing. Please confirm that. What they're really doing is trying to get a deductive change. They just don't want to call it that, right? So we need to be careful about that because sometimes requests for clarification or substitution are really just backdoor change orders. And then the other thing is that because there's less information available at bid and more of the exploratory stuff, and we're going to talk about that in a second, more of the exploratory stuff is put on the design builder. Some of your typical RFIs, like, hey, can you confirm if there's a water line there, or who owns that water line, et cetera, might not be a BART question. It actually might be a design builder question. So you got to go back to the contract and say, what does the contract say? Is it really my responsibility or is it the design builder? Okay, labor compliance. This ties back to what I said about how there's two kinds of work now. There's office type work and there's field type work. And so I stole these pictures to sort of illustrate that. On the left is physical craft labor, prevailing wage, being performed out in the field, tracked contemporaneously by a designer. On the right is a designer, engineer, never gets his fingernails dirty, works in an office, and honestly, not a lot of visibility on that. But I just do that to highlight that there is a fair bit of gray in between the black and the white there, right? We have some where, you might have technicians out in the field doing testing. Sometimes they have to adjust wiring to do that. So it's very important that we understand where the correct split is between what I'm calling covered labor or craft type labor that would fall under prevailing wage and this other type of work that doesn't. Um, So now I'm going to get into a little bit of BART jargon. So forgive me if I'm going too deep here. But at BART, we have a form called an MUR, which is the thing that is used to identify who did work out in the field. And labor compliance uses that to verify that primes are paying their subs. So it's a very important document. But it's targeted at that first bucket, at that craft labor. Okay, so it's important that we know the difference between craft and not craft. And also in particular for that middle range, right? So if you have an engineer on site, it doesn't automatically mean that that's covered just because they're wearing boots. If the engineer is simply there to verify visually that the design that they provided is being built that way, that's not necessarily covered work. So just something to be aware of because it's more complicated than in a design bid build where essentially everything that happens in the field is construction. So utilities. I touched on this a little bit, but in general, one of the biggest drivers, right, of differing sites is utilities, right? They're where they're not supposed to be. They're not where they are supposed to be. They're different. They take longer to move. Um, in design build, more of the emphasis, and you have to read your contract, but more of the emphasis is typically put on the design builder to go out there and do their investigation. So why does that matter? There are two types of differing site conditions in general. One kind is a thing that you told me that is there is not there. Or worse, a thing that you didn't tell me is there, right? That's the typical one. But there's a second kind, which is a thing that is of a type or character that could not have been assumed at bid time. And that's a trickier one because it uses words like reasonable and things like that. It's that second one that you're mostly going to see in design build. So the typical example for that would be geotechnical. But I'll try to use a utility example, which would be, okay, if you have two manholes and you go out and do your investigation, you find out there's a storm drain that connects those two manholes, that's reasonable and you should have assumed that at bid time, right? Manholes usually connect to things. But if you were in a BART yard and you found a 60-inch fuel line going out to the airport that nobody could have reasonably foreseen, you could argue that that's a differing site. So because the timing of it is really critical, right? It's more expensive that later in construction you find it. The design builder has responsibility to do that advanced detection. And just as a reminder, BART facilities usually don't get those on a USA ticket. So just be sure that you work with BART as well to make sure the BART utilities, because sometimes there's nothing more embarrassing than finding all the other third-party utilities and then there's a BART one right there and you go, oh, whoops. So as an example, putting in under crossing at a BART facility, this happened on a design build that I'm on, and the utility was not shown in the contract, and the contractor came back and said, well, pay me. Well, in reality, the design builder was required to do a certain amount of investigation. They didn't meet the standard in that case, and so it was not a change order. If they had done sufficient investigation and due diligence, then that's a different question. Document control. This ties back to some of the stuff we said before about the way submittals and RFIs are put together, but mostly submittals, right? Version control is really, really critical. It's always critical, but in design build, especially so because you have different phases of submittals, right? So it's critical that you know not just whether a submittal has been submitted, approved, etc., but also what level it is, right? Because you could be building off 65% plans. There's nothing wrong with that in a design build. And so you just need to know what's going on. And in particular, everyone who's looking at it has to have the most up-to-date version of it. You need to be able to track those gaps between what is required and what is being provided. And then a little bit on as-builds, because you're going to be building this stuff um, at all phases of the design, it's really important that we keep up to date on the as-builds because it's not something you just punt to the end of a job, as often happens on design bid build. We have to be doing these as we're going. So we talked about it. I think the biggest example is on submittals, right? You need a way to track in your document control system that you have 35, 65, not just different disciplines, but different phases. Because as we said, you can complete different levels of the design, right? An example would be, you know, I've approved a design for a generic antenna with a generic foundation, but then the actual physical location, you may have additional design you need to do for that particular location. So it can be approved as a design concept, but there may be additional work that has to happen for different installation, and that's a dynamic thing, not on unlike on a design bid build where you'd have to do that via change order. So risk. We talked about that a little bit with the progressive, where part of the advantage is to bucket these risks, right? So the biggest difference in risk, I would say, is that the typical differing site conditions that hold up a lot of risk in design bid build, those ones tend to be lesser because there's things that you can do about it through the design process to minimize that risk. Right. So rather than being handed a completed set and say, here you go, Mr. Contractor, figure it out, there's things that you can do to minimize those risks. So those tend to be better mitigatable on a design build. The flip side of that is that scope issues tend to loom larger. Right. And we're going to get into that a little bit of the way the BART does it. But it's really critical that we have a tied risk register to those buckets, and those are identified early on in the design process. So a BART specific example, this happens at every agency, but we're talking about BART here, is that for things that aren't wrong and aren't right, but come down to preference, in general, BART at the very preliminary level will have received this concurrence, if you will, from what they call internal stakeholders, right? So if you're building a crossover, you'll have got track and structures concurrence, you'll get RSNS concurrence. Um, but let's be honest, sometimes just because you've got the division chief's sign off doesn't necessarily mean the person who's actually going to be working on your thing agrees to it. So it's really important that you work with your stakeholders and make sure that what I call the boots on the ground, the actual person approving it, is also on the same page. Because if not, it's just going to get more expensive later. So it's important that we communicate with them early and often, let them know what they're going to get, not in mumbo jumbo, but in actual concrete terms. And then that we're also stewards of the scope, right? Because it's very easy to just say, oh, well, BART wants it made out of platinum, not out of plastic. Well, BART may like platinum, but platinum is a lot more expensive than plastic. And so we need to explain to them that while we're able to facilitate that, we don't recommend it because it costs a lot more and it's really not that much better than plastic. So the key out of all of that really is communication, shepherding the scope, communicating with your stakeholders, and making sure that that process works. Insurance. A lot of these big design build contracts, or even the smaller ones, have larger limits and also require consultants to carry insurance that we typically don't carry, right? So if you're a designer, for instance, you might be asked to carry general liability for construction type work. Um, you might you might be looking at very high E&O limits. And also on DB contracts, BART is moving towards this model of self-insurance where they have this program called OSIP. So that's something to consider as well, where you may have to have health and safety insurance. So in my experience with this, I think the biggest thing, and I should say that I'm presupposing in this that you're not the prime, you're a sub. I'm presupposing. Oh, sorry. The biggest thing is to discuss this with your prime, right? So sometimes you can exclude certain coverage if you can convince all parties that you're just not going to do it, right? So if you're a designer, you don't need to go out in the field. Sometimes if you say that and you get the prime to sign off on that, then the prime will cover you, but you don't need to have that insurance for something you'll never need. You can purchase these umbrella coverages that are site specific to BART. It's cheaper than upping your overall coverage if you're working on multiple projects at a time. But I think the best thing to do is work with your prime, see if you can limit those coverage based on the size of your contract. Right, E&O is a classic example. Very difficult to get $5 or $10 million in coverage for a small firm. So I would work with my prime and try to limit that based on your scope, if that is something you're concerned about. Okay, let's talk about inspection. So the biggest difference between inspecting a design bid build and a design build contract is the level of inspection required. So remember, in this scenario, we're not the quality assurance. And so really the design builder is responsible for the product at the end of the day. So BART still wants people out there. They want to make sure things are done safely and in conformance with the relevant SSWP, but we don't have the same level of responsibility in terms of assuring the work that goes on the ground is the work that they paid for. Um, it's also important that we're looking at the most recent design information. Remember that because you could be building off a 65% plan set, it's really, really important that the person who's physically watching it is comparing it to the most recent design. Otherwise, you're looking at yesterday's newspaper and it's not helpful. So an example would be on quantities, right? Remember we talked about how the quantities may not and probably are not going to be overly laid out at the beginning of the job. So in this case, while we can track what was performed, we can't really track it against a plan per se. So really what we can do is make sure that there's an accepted, approved SSWP and that the work is being performed in accordance to that, including whatever safety elements they have, that it complies with BFS, with the BART standards, and quality oversight as we described, but not quality assurance. Let's talk about real estates and permits and things like that. So this is very similar to the situation with utilities. This is one of those things that can slow construction contracts down. And again, it's not the getting the permit, it's not knowing that you needed a permit and then having to wait 6 months while you talk to Caltrans or whoever else is the permit holder. So similar to utilities, a lot of the responsibility in this case is transferred from the owner, in this case BART, to the design builder. So theoretically, the design builder should have gone out and sought some of these things. But in many cases, these agencies are not really going to be talking to a private entity. They're going to be talking to BART. So just to be clear, I'm not just talking about actual property takes, which are fairly rare and usually identified early, but things like construction easements, access roads, even aerial easements. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know till you know it, and then it's often too late at that point. So my simple advice on that one is don't do it. If there's a way to design around a permit, it's almost always cheaper than trying to go through the permit process. And no one will ever tell you that a permit's going to take you a year and a half to get. They're going to tell you they're going to work with you. They're going to tell you they're going to be good partners and they're going to get it done in 3 weeks, and then 3 more weeks, and then 3 more weeks. Permits are like delays on airlines, right? They never tell you the flight's delayed 5 hours. They tell you it's 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 minutes, right? So that's how you look at a big fat delay, and then you go back and say, holy smokes, how did we have a 3-month delay on this job because of a permit? That's how you had a 3-month delay. So I would say that the best way is just to not do it, right? So an example, you can see that block wall over there. This was a recent example. The property line is not well defined. It goes through that block wall. And this is very common in property. You'd think the world would be better divvied up, but basically it wasn't clear who owned it. And so it came down to whether we had to get a permit, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, we simply just redesigned, put the antenna on the other side, much cheaper than going through it. That's my recommendation. SSWPs, always a big thing here at BART. Not fundamentally different. It's still our job to get multiple SSWPs to work with the team here at BART to make sure that it goes through. The tricky part is that there's more of a fluidity between the end of design and start build. And we've talked about that, but you have to look at that. In particular, when you're looking at the schedule, in addition to having that overlap, you also might have activities that aren't fully fleshed out yet, right? So it's not uncommon that you might have a big block of activity called phase 3, and you'll break into phase 3 later when you know more about phase 1 and phase 2. So that's the biggest difference really to the schedule, that it contains both design and build, and that all the detail may not be available on day 1. We've talked about this a bit, but the design builder might not be a builder per se. So why does that matter to us? It matters to us because some of the stuff that we've talked about, changes, pay process, all this kind of stuff, we just assume that our counterparts are going to be fluent in this, and they may not be, right? And so all that means is we just got to work a little harder on our side to familiarize themselves with it, work with them, and make sure that they're following the process correctly. So let's summarize. Design build is a process which is quicker and more versatile than design bid build, but it's harder to control the scope. There are different opportunities that exist for consultants on design build. DSDC, CM, review, and even core design are all available. They're just slightly different format than they would be on a design bid build. The processes for things like pay application, changes, labor compliance, insurance, things like that are different, and they're different fundamentally because there's 2 types of work on a design build: field work and office work, and those 2 are treated differently. And that's why those processes are different, but also fundamentally because the scope is not fully identified at bid day. And because of that, there's more ambiguity into what's going on. And so that's why those processes differ. Quality, we've talked about, is different because the role of the design builder is different. It covers both QC and the QA. Still a role for the consultant, a different role. The utility and the right-of-way permit process is different because more of the risk is put on the design builder. So more of that is actually part of the contract. So it's less about receiving 100% plan set and then issuing different site condition change orders, and more about the design builder doing their due diligence and making sure that they can work around the process. If you can work around the problem, always cheaper than trying to move the utility or get the permit. Submittals, RFIs, dock control, and inspection need to account for both the design and the build side, as well as the fact that those are overlaid, right? This is my bad design version of of a CPM schedule. But you understand what I'm saying? They're overlaid on top of each other, and therefore there's fluidity between those two phases that are normally kept separate. And there are challenges. And some of the big challenges have to do with scope, right? A big one is always an issue on contracts, but more so on design build, is the difference between a nice to have and things that are really required. So now we're talking Lamborghini versus Chevrolet. Do you really need a Lamborghini, or does it just look really, really cool? The DB may not be a builder, and so there are challenges with how much experience they may have. You'll have multiple SSWPs you'll have to deal with at a time. This can be true on design bid build as well, but always a challenge here at BART. And the schedule is typically accepted prior to fleshing out the full detail. So there's more buildup, if you will, of baseline rather than just day one baseline acceptance. So if you just take three things away from this, what I would say are, first of all, there are differences, functional differences between design build and design bid build. Those differences are not uniformly positive or minus. There's some pluses and there's some minuses on this, but although different, opportunities do exist at BART to do all the core types of work that we've typically done for BART, whether it be CM, design, construction, all those still exist in a design build environment. They're just slightly different, and it's important that we understand those differences if we're going to work here at BART. Oh, I'm sorry, that one does not exist. So ignore the second to last slide. And I see there's already a lot of questions in the chat, and I was trying to do some of them live, but I'll turn it back to Harry, and you can tell me how you want to handle that part.
Okay, well, thank you. And there are some really good questions in the chat. I think what we'll do is I will unmute everyone, and so that we can answer, so they can ask those questions directly. If I can. Yeah, I see a hand here. Let me. Um, yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to unmute a person, and it's a little easier. Not as straightforward as I thought. Pardon me for the confusion here. So I see, Frank, can you,
Okay, yeah, I got him. Hi.
okay, great.
Yeah, the one thing that I wanted to ask is there any opportunity for us to provide like a technical, like a launch and learn to the team, like for glass fiber rebars are very critical for near high voltage, and also it's much more stronger than a steel rebar. It doesn't corrode, it doesn't injure the workers, it's green, sustainable, all of that. And it's been used in a lot of the high-speed rails and stuff. So I'm wondering if you guys are open to it, and how can we approach you to do like a lunch and learn to the team, because the technology has been around since 1950s, but now is the time that the standards and codes are out there, and a lot of people are starting to use it, and there's a lot of cases. So how will we go about that? Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Frank. And that's a great question. Questions that are specifically in regard to the BART Police Headquarters project, we'll be referring to Fei Lu, who is our contact within the Office of Civil Rights, and he'll be handling that. And I'll put his information into the chat, and so that so that we can relay that to him. I mean, so the focus of this webinar, of course, is in general about the progressive design build process. We do know that, of course, that the police headquarters project is coming up, and there will be a separate series of webinars and information about that. Also, in terms of, if you'd like to be a part of that, that outreach, we can refer you over to, again, Michael Reyes is a part of our pre-award program. and we're participating in that process, but we can't really address the team, the police headquarters team itself at this point. Information about the trade packages or anything that's coming out. But again, we can refer that over to Feilu because there will be more information coming out, and we can definitely take a note and make that contact for you. Does that sort of answer your question at all? Oh, okay, great. Are there any other questions? I know there were a few in the chat, and feel free to unmute your mic if you can. I thought I'd be able to do that to the group as a whole. It's a little trickier, but.
Yes, I have a question. My name is Charlene Jones.
Yes, hello.
Abundance Worldwide Enterprises. So my question is in the chat, and it says, can we all receive a past historical document that shows the difference between today's bidding processes and this design build? Like, for example, can I receive my particular scope of work is the dump trucks, and they're building buildings today without digging much dirt. So can I get a past historical document or a bid that's old from years 5, 10, 15 years ago versus today's construction design build so I can bid the job correctly is my point. Thank you. Is my question. Thank you.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not completely sure. I may have to do a little research to get the best answer back to you on that question. And again, that gets into an understanding into how to bid the work that's coming up. And so, that's something. I can take a note, and I have to research that. I can work with our pre-award team, and of course, refer that over to Faye and to also Filippo, who is part of BART's contract compliance unit, who's also dealing directly with the police headquarters project. I'm not sure if anybody is here might like to say anything, perhaps in regard to that. But no problem.
I'll listen for your email. Thank you.
Sure. Were there any other questions?
I have a question for you, Harry.
Yes.
This is Jamie Jones. It's in reference back to the BART police station project via Faye and you, as well as Mr. Reyes. What I'd like to do is I send over my SOQ to all three of you. And regarding to design support, when it comes to the digital plan sheets, all the drawings or any renderings for that, will that be done in Rivet? And then if that's going to be subbed out in terms of scope of work, will we be designing in current Rivet format in the project schedule? So therefore, all deliverables throughout the whole project schedule is done correctly through those checkpoints. So the question would be, what software are we using in CAD? Is that going to be done through DWG, and then everyone's designing in Rivet as on the design build project?
I see. Again, that's an excellent question. I please send me an email.
I'll just send that to you,
and I'll relay that over. Off the top of my head, I have no idea. And again, this workshop is, we don't have specific information about the police headquarters project, but again, we have the contacts, within the Office of Civil Rights. So, I'm happy to relay that information over, those questions over. Absolutely. there any other questions? Okay, well, I think that may complete our webinar for the morning. Thank you. I see a lot of people. Well, no, not everybody tuned out. So yeah,
Great job, Raphael.
Thank you.
Great job, Raphael and Harry. Great job running this today. Appreciate that.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Michael.
Thank you, guys.
All right.
And
Thanks.
you should just let people know that they will get the meeting has been recorded. There'll be copies of the presentation to be made available. We'll provide some additional contacts, as Harry mentioned, vis-a-vis Faye and Michael Ray's and others, so that you could get word about upcoming webinars. And I think there's an upcoming webinar next Friday, the 28th, on finance, small business support, and cash flow management. And so, Harry, you might want to just put up that slide so folks know that that's happening and they know how to register for that one as well. But just thank everybody for participating, and thank you, Raphael, for a good presentation.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I was in the process of doing that, and that slide is right here. So this is for the webinar that we have coming up on the 28th, is the financial management for contractors. And you see members of our pre-award team who are putting that together, including Mr. Reyes, who's here. Would you like to say anything about that, Michael?
I'm just about to drop the registration link into the chat.
Right.
And this is really a must-see because it really goes into the financial management and back office aspect when it comes to subcontractors and projects, especially BART projects. So I think it's going to be a useful, energized, I would say, robust perspective of how understanding the finance side can help you and your company. Let me drop that right now into the chat so everyone here can. It's a quick registration. It'll be on Zoom. You'll see myself and the rest of the BART SBSS team, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you.
All right. Absolutely. Thank you. And so, again, so here is some of our contact information with for the team and for Fei Lu in the Office of Civil Rights. And I believe that concludes our webinar for the morning. Unless there are any other questions or anything else.
No, thank you, sir.
You're very welcome. I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. And have a great day. And again, if there's anything else we can do to help you be successful at BART, that's what we're here for.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, I can do that. I had a request for the last slide. Was that the slide that was requested for the contact information? And yes, Mohammed, the slides and recording will be available. The recording will be on our YouTube website, and the slides can be sent out to you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. And have a good day, everybody. I am going to end the meeting.